So let's go back to 1 Peter, verse 11. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom be praise and dominion for ever and ever. Amen. So it was Saint Peter who said these words, but what was he talking about when he said these words? The assumption, of course, is he saying, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. Then it would follow that he too must have been speaking at the same time as the oracles of God. Oracles meaning a place of divine utterance, or speaking as from the Spirit of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth. So God must have gave him the ability to speak these words, seeing these words are recorded down and are written really as pure gold for us to read, and for many generations to read, not only in the last days, but even going back from when they were first written. So it's interesting to look at the two chapters really in context, whatever they call it, where these words were spoken. So what was he speaking about? And we have a form of divine authority here as coming from one of Jesus's disciples, Peter, saying to Peter, thou art upon this rock, being Jesus, right? Not necessarily Peter. Will I build my church, meaning the called out ones, the children of God. So Peter was going to be a leader, and so he leads, and he's written this down, and so we read and we understand. So what was he talking about when he said these words? You kind of go back here, and it's interesting what he was actually talking about. And to go back to chapter 3, these chapters, don't forget, a lot of them are all connected. They're not all always going into different subjects. Often they continue from one subject and carry on in the next chapter, talking about much the same thing. So to go, rather than read the whole book, which you haven't got time for, so chapter 3, verse 18, it starts here, let's say, and I guess part of the theme here is that we should make progress in this life, seeing there's another life after this life, and to watch out for that other place that a lot of preachers like to talk about, and they like to harp on and on and on and on about hellfire. So I don't really like being a hellfire preacher, but some preachers just love to talk about hell, and hellfire and eternal hell and damnation and everything else. But when you actually go back to the original words, and someone like Peter really was a very forceful person. And, when they come to arrest Jesus, it was Peter who got his sword out and cut off one of the soldiers' ears, kind of thing. I guess it must have been either cut off or hanging there, but whatever. Jesus touched the person's ear, and the ear was made better. So Jesus, you picture, well, Jesus must have been under great duress and strain, been sweating, it says, as it were, great drops of blood, when he was crying in the garden, asking God to take away the cut from him. he knew what was coming. So he knew for centuries before what was coming. So for Jesus to reach out and touch the soldier's ear in compassion, the very people that were coming to arrest him and everything else, he still maintained compassion and touched that person's ear, whereas Peter would run in, would be like a bull in a china shop, get out his sword and lash out in all directions, and consequently hacked off or nearly hacked off or whatever a person's ear. Then Jesus reached out and touched that person's ear and told Peter to put away his sword. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. So that was often the picture you got of Peter, that he was a bit of a bull in a china shop. But I guess he must have Jesus said to Peter, Simon, his name was Simon Peter, right? Satan have desired to have thee, that he might sift thee as wheat. But I have prayed for thee that thy faith fail thee not. And so when thou art converted, it said, strengthen thy brethren. So here's Peter strengthening his brethren, as Jesus said would happen. Satan obviously desired to have him, that he might sift him as wheat. In other words, sift out the faith, take out the golden faith out of him, and render him useless without faith. But clearly Jesus had prayed for him. And you think, well, that's good, because he must pray for us too, that Satan might have desired to have us, that he might sift us as wheat. And sift, in other words, sift out. Usually sift flour in order to get the lumps out, but the lumps that were being taken out by Satan, if Satan had his way, is he would like to sift out the golden faith that is in us. So the words of Jesus, really. So Simon, Simon, Satan have desired to have thee, that he might sift thee as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail thee not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. And so Peter did. And here are some of the words of Peter. So we'd all wonder what, seeing Jesus said to Peter, thou art Cephas, a rock, or, in other words, he'd be pretty a stable person, I guess, in the end. But on the other hand, he was saying, upon this rock, meaning Jesus, right? Jesus being the rock, I will build my church. And so Peter, being one of the original disciples, and building on the foundation, the true foundation, which is Jesus Christ, the rock. So Peter coming through in the end, being sifted as wheat by Satan, but Jesus praying for him, that his faith fail him not, and so he came through as gold tried in the fire. It will come through as even purer gold. So these are golden words as spoken by Peter, who no doubt gone through the fire of God's testing and come through as pure gold, because Jesus had prayed for him that his faith would fail him not. And so here's the golden words as spoken by Peter, and he's talking about that other place. And rather than be a hellfire Peter person who might get out his sword and start thrashing around and stuff like hellfire preachers do, they love to damn and curse and send people to hell, which really goes against largely the compassion that Jesus had. They were coming to get him, right, to take him in a sense to hell, because that's where he was going. Though Jesus didn't call it hell, he called it the underworld, and he placed it at the heart of the earth, which is a strange thing, really, because hell and the heart don't kind of go together. But however you look at that, he placed the place where people go when they die at the heart of the earth. And so Jesus was from that point onwards going through hell, really, but hell not in the sense of the word hell, where there's hellfire, but a form of God's wrath upon the sinner, but not necessarily eternal hell. So Jesus took a punishment for us, and that punishment really was largely symbolic of the wrath of God, which God would pour out upon the sinner. And so Jesus took the whole punishment, including going to that place that people love to call hell, which Jesus called the heart of the earth. Likewise, as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of a whale, so also shall the Son of Man be 3 days in the heart of the earth. So Jesus came to die the death of a sinner, and to die the death of the sinner under the wrath of God, which is poured out upon the sinner. So if we want a kind of a measurement of God's wrath, then we look at Jesus, who was no doubt up all night here. His ordeal started when he was placed into the hands of sinful men, and then Peter thinking he could rescue Jesus with his sword. But Jesus was ordained to go through that chastisement, which the whole thing really largely symbolic of a chastisement from God really upon the sinner. And that chastisement in this sense being symbolic of the wrath of God. And so Jesus taking the wrath of God for the sinner, and then even going to that underworld that preachers love to call hell, to take a punishment there also for the sinner. So offering hope in hell. And a lot of preachers again like to say there's no hope whatsoever in hell. That once you reject Jesus in this life and you go to hellfire, then there's no hope for you and it's eternal damnation. But that can be true and can be not. It would be eternal damnation if you're choosing it that way. Now, if there are choices in hell and you can choose eternal life there, and Jesus preached to people in that underworld that they love to call hell, so I don't like even calling it hell, because Jesus didn't exactly call it hell. He said, likewise also as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of a whale, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days at the heart of the earth. You think to yourself, well, what did he do when he was there for 3 days at the heart of the earth? Well, Peter goes into that. And Peter here saying the oracles of God, so the assumption here is that he's also speaking as the oracles of God. So he says in verse 17, verse 18, let's say, for Christ also have once suffered for sins, right? So he took a chastisement, in short. God's wrath poured out upon the sinner. So the sinner being the world of sinners all rolled into one, in a sense. Every unimaginable, imaginable sin committed, right? There's murder, there's rape, there's the worst abominable things, imaginable and unimaginable, that a sinner will do. And so Jesus took a chastisement for all. Now, you might not think you're a murderer or a rapist or a thief or a liar or a cheat. Well, Jesus took a punishment for all, including the worst offenders, including the people that were arresting him and taking him to his inevitable execution and his death and 39 stripes. So the whole thing largely symbolic of the wrath of God. 39 stripes, they say, was the basic punishment that would have come to offenders in the days of the Roman Empire. So 39 stripes Jesus would have took, and his whole ordeal starting as soon as he was placed into the hands of sinful men, right? And so the whole thing symbolic of a punishment upon the worst offenders. Crucifixion in those days being a punishment for the worst offenders. So largely reality for Jesus, but symbolic for us, a punishment for the worst of the worst in the days of Rome. so that we might understand that it was a punishment. Jesus gave his own life into the hands of sinful men. God ordained it to happen. Jesus had prayed in that garden that God would take away that cup from him, but nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. Jesus knew what was going to come. He could have ran away there and then, but instead he stuck around and waited for his executioners to come. And so they arrested him, and so Peter lashed out. But Peter, I guess, learned to be less of a bull in a china shop and speak the absolute words of God. So we can fully rely upon these words, because Jesus said he would come forth as gold. I pray for thee, that thy faith fail thee not. So what's Peter saying about the underworld, and not so much being a hellfire preacher, if ever he was, or saying he ever was, but he was a very forceful personality. And even when he denied Jesus, you picture him lashing out with his tongue. You know, he denied him thrice. And so finally he would have said, I don't effing well know him. He didn't say he swore, but you picture him as being that kind of person who would really forcefully deal with it and crush it and find his way through sheer force of will. That was the kind of picture you got of Peter, but you kind of picture maybe God had allowed things to happen to him and it kind of humbled him. Who knows? I don't know. So you think, well, I guess he must have been pretty compassionate, and he certainly doesn't come over as a hellfire preacher when you read these words. So he's saying, for Christ also have once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. So put to death in the flesh, Jesus' last breath, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So he done no wrong, and God had forsook him whilst on a cross. Jesus died whilst on a cross. It wasn't the cross itself that killed him. The cross was a symbolic from God, really, a punishment for sinners which Jesus took. And then Jesus' last breath saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He's done no wrong. So he clearly suffered for us and gave up the ghost at that point and died of what you might call spiritual death. God forsook him, became separated from God and gave up the ghost. So he gave up the ghost, his dead body's lying on that cross. He died before the two men that were with him. 6 hours into his ordeal, he died when God forsook him. So when God forsook him, his body died. Jesus died of a broken heart. And then where did he go when he gave up the ghost? He gave out a loud cry, it says, no doubt the agony of the death of the sinner who dies without God. So the death of the sinner who dies without God is an agonizing death. So you die without God, and you've got no hope or knowing where you're going. But Jesus knew where people go when they die. And so he was going to take the whole punishment for mankind, including going to hell, going to the underworld, which they call hell, which Jesus called the place at the heart of the earth, where clearly people go when they die. This world being a kind of a multi-dimensional place, and kind of tied in with this world is that other dimension, which we call the spiritual world. And so Jesus passed from this physical dimension into the spiritual dimension, which he placed at the heart of the earth. And what did he do there for 3 days? He gave up the ghost. And where did in other words, his spirit left his body. So where did he go? His lifeless corpse was placed in another man's grave in the tomb. There was another man's grave which was dug out for him in a tomb. And that's where they placed his lifeless body. So where was he for 3 days? Well, Peter here, who's not a hellfire preacher at all, tells us where Jesus went. For Christ also have once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened, in other words, made alive by the Spirit. So he died the death of a sinner, separated from God, and then was made alive by the Spirit of God, spiritually made alive again. So his ghost, his spirit, where does it go? Go to verse 19, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. So he went down to the heart of the earth, as he said he would, for 3 days. And now Peter gives us insight into what on earth was he doing at the heart of the earth for 3 days. By which also it says he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. So here we are on the surface of this earth. And little do we know that at the very heart of this earth, in another dimension called the spiritual dimension, at the heart of the earth, that's where people go when they die. So they're kind of still wrapped up with this world in another dimensional sense. And, you know, it's like a wall, really. Like I say, across this room here, I can look over there and I can see a wall, and we got photos on it, a clock and shelves and what have you. But it wouldn't surprise you, how much are we aware that the wall, let's say it's about a foot thick, for want of a better measurement. Well, directly behind that wall, there's a neighbour. This house is joined to another house. So you got 2 houses joined together in one with a wall between the two. Now, I'm about 10 foot away from that wall, 8 foot. But probably at the other side of that wall, I know there's a neighbour that lives there. There's an old man. He's about 99, I think, by now, actually. And he'd be sat there at the other side of that wall. Am I aware of him? No, he's kind of in that sense in another dimension. So that other dimension is like passing through a wall. And we're so much wrapped up in our world, say, in this front room, in this house, what have you, stairs and bedrooms and everything else, our dimension, that we're so oblivious to the neighbours who live next door, only just the other side of that wall there. And that's kind of how you might view that other world, that other dimension down there at the heart of the earth. They're only, they're in another dimension. And they're kind of stuck in that dimension, and we're stuck in our material dimension. But Jesus, when he gave up the ghost, he went and preached unto the spirits which were in prison. But this is Peter, the oracle of God, right? By which also he died, was quickened by the Spirit, gave up the ghost 6 hours into his ordeal. His lifeless body was left behind. The soldier came along and stuck a spear in the side of that body. Clearly it was dead. They took the body away and dressed it up and put everything like a napkin on him or whatever they do. In those days, Mary tending to the body before the Sabbath day and everything else, putting his lifeless body in the tomb. Well, while all this was going on, Jesus was, as he said, as Jonah was 3 days in the belly, the 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a whale, so also shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights at the heart of the earth. So Jonah, in other words, he looked like a goner. No way that man's coming back from where he's gone to. Look, he looked like he was drowning, and then a great big fish, it says, came and swallowed him. He's a goner forever. But 3 days and 3 days and 3 nights later, that God told that fish to spew up Jonah onto the shore. So very symbolic of Jesus, who went down to the heart of the earth. That whale swimming in deep waters, no doubt, swimming way down to the bottom of that ocean. And Jonah looking like a goner for sure. Well, Jesus looked like a goner for sure. But 3 days and 3 nights later, Jesus is going to rise again. So his lifeless body in the tomb, sort of like the body in the belly of a whale, but the spirit going through literal hell, not hellfire hell, but the place at the heart of the earth. And what was he doing there? By which also, it gives the answer here, by which also he went and preached. Now, preached unto the spirits in prison. which sometime were disobedient when once the long suffering. Notice here the long suffering of God. Hellfire preachers don't put a lot of emphasis on the long suffering of God. So look at the long suffering of God. The God when sometime disobedient, which was sometime disobedient, right? He preached to the spirits in prison, right? Which sometime were disobedient when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. It was 120 years that God waited in the days of Noah. So long suffering God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. So what he means there is Noah and his wife and three sons and their 3 wives. So 8 people all in all were saved, wherein few, there's 8 souls, were saved by water. So the floods came in and the boat went up. So they were saved by water in the sense that the floods came in and the boat went up. Well, the floods that came in for the ones that chose not to believe, they would have gone down in their spirits, their bodies dying in the waters, and their spirits going, them giving up the ghost, right, giving up the spirit in their bodies, and their spirits leaving their bodies. And where do they go? Down to the heart of the earth. Whereas Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and 3 wives of the 3 sons, 8 people all in all, they went up. So up for them and down, those that receive Jesus, right, we go up. Dead in Christ will rise first, and we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So in this sense, we have the hope of the resurrection, whereas others who've rejected Jesus, they go down. So the believers go up, it's like Noah and his family went up, and the unbelievers go down to where? To the heart of the earth. So then he goes on to verse 21, the like figure, whereunto even baptism doth also save us. So like the waters go up and we go up to be with Jesus eventually, whereas the sinners go down. So the like figure, whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. And then it's going brackets, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. So not kind of like a works trip where we do our best to get everything right and not wrong, but more in the hope of the resurrection of Jesus, because he got everything right in his life. He was in all points tempted like as we are, in other words, yet without sin. And then he finally died the death of a sinner, took a punishment that the worst sinners in the world deserve, the wrath of God should eventually come upon the world, right? And but we chose to believe in Jesus, believing he died for the whole of mankind, not just for one nation, being the Jews, but for the Gentiles, the heathen, for every person on this earth. Jesus died and took a punishment for, and no matter what their sins were, from the worst to the not so worst to whatever. So one punishment for the whole of mankind. So so it goes on. So basically, Jesus went down to the heart of the earth and preached to the spirits which were one time disobedient when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, wherein 8 souls were saved, yet so as by water. So why would Jesus go and preach to the past generations, let's say the worst generation in the Bible, along with Noah and the days a lot, but it's talking about Noah here. You kind of get a yardstick when it talks about Noah. There was a very violent day and age. And it says the imagination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually, and the earth was filled with violence in the days of Noah. So you kind of see that as a kind of a yardstick. You think, well, if Jesus went and preached unto the spirits which were in prison, which were one time disobedient in the days of Noah, when once the long suffering of God waited, right? There was about 120 years. And yet Jesus goes down there and preaches to them. Why would he preach to them if he wasn't offering them hope? So he took a punishment for the sinner. He took a punishment for the worst offenders, as well as for every possible sinner or sin that has ever been committed. Jesus took the whole lot upon him and took a punishment from God. And then died, and then took the whole punishment, and even went to hell for the sinner. The sinner dies, right? And the last breath of the sinner is they will die without God. So Jesus died without God and gave out a loud cry, and that God separating Jesus from himself made Jesus die of a broken heart. Jesus couldn't live without God's Spirit, and so his body died, and then his spirit left his body and went down into the heart of the earth. So he took the whole punishment. He even went to hell, because that's where the sinner goes when he dies. He goes to the heart of the earth, which people love to call hell. So Jesus took the whole punishment for every one of us, so that if we end up in Hades, in other words, the underworld, the place where people go when they die, at the heart of the earth, that other dimension, then he also offers hope in that place. So there's a very, 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 very slim hope here. But you could say there's even slimmer hope down there at the heart of the earth, but there's still hope. So he preached to the spirits which were once disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, wherein 8 souls were saved, yet so as by water. So you think it was a very, very, very violent generation, and the imagination thoughts their heart only evil continually. And yet here's Jesus offering mercy, offering them a way out in hell, at the heart of the earth. And clearly he did, because I mean some preachers dispute this, and they love to think Jesus was preaching to the sons of God, these fallen angels. But Jesus came to die for the sins of mankind. It wasn't his whole ministry was not for the not so much for the fallen angels, which were one time disobedient also during the days of Noah. But it was the sons of God that married the daughters of men, that the children were born unto these daughters of the men, and they were the children of what they call the Nephilim. They call the Nephilim and everything else, children of the sons of God and everything else. Jesus' ministry wasn't preaching to them. He's clearly preaching. His whole ministry on this earth was with mankind. So the spirits which were one time disobedient during the days of Noah, wherein 8 souls were saved, yet so as by water, is talking about mankind. So Jesus preached in this world to mankind, and he also then went down into the heart of the earth to preach to mankind down there, those that had left their bodies giving up the ghost and going to the underworld at the heart of the earth. So Jesus' message was to the whole of mankind, those that are in this world and those that are in that other world at the heart of the earth. And so he preached to them. Why preach to them if he wasn't giving them hope? Well, it makes it clearer on the next page here in the next chapter. And it talks about this, that, and the other, and it goes on. For as much then as Christ have suffered for us, which he did, not only for us in this world, but also for them in the other world, in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that have suffered in the flesh have ceased from sin, right? Jesus, he overcame the sins. He was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So he overcame the lusts of human flesh, right? And then died for the sins of mankind. Not only died in this world by dying the death of the sinner without God, he then went to the heart of the earth to do the whole package. He took the whole package and then preach to them which are in prison in that world at the heart of the earth. So he preached to the whole of mankind and made the gospel completely clear to us in this world and completely clear to them in that world. And then it goes on to say that they're going to be judged like we are in this world, and makes it clear. So he's arm yourself. So we should follow Jesus's example. Peter says that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh, which we live in the flesh, and we live in this flesh, right? What are we living to? The lusts of men. We have all these leaders and the lusts of men. At the moment, we're subjected to the lusts of men. There's a power struggle going on in the world, and the powers that be that are ordained of God, and we all know who they are. They have a desperate lust for power. So we're caught up in their power struggle. So Peter is saying here that we should follow Jesus' example, right? He suffered for the sins of mankind, for as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh. So he was in the flesh. Arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin. So Jesus overcame all the lusts of the flesh, that he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, so which we're subject to. They put us on lockdown, well, we're on a lockdown. If they do this to us, or they wreck everyone's small businesses, then we're all kind of subject to the lusts of the flesh, the lusts of men. But that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. For the time past our life may suffer us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revellings, banquetings, and abominable desires, right? Much like they did in the days of Noah. It's like that now in the last days, right? As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the Son of Man appears, right? The second coming of Jesus. The world's going to be much like the days of Noah. The imagination, the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, and the earth was filled with violence. So wherein they think it strange, so such people that are into all these things, wherein they think it strange that you run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. Why don't you get into all this? Why don't you come to a party? Why don't you get drunk? Why don't you do 1,000 other things like us? And they see you as being different, so they single you out for rough justice. So who shall give an account to him that is ready to judge the quick, the living, right, and the dead? Now he goes back to the subject of the underworld in verse 6. The kind of theme which was going through it. For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead. So clearly preaching to human beings, such like human beings who were into the revellings, banquetings, abominable idolatries, walking in lasciviousness and lust, right, like in the days of Noah. Clearly preaching to such people as these. And now he goes back to that kind of theme. For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead. Clearly preaching to the dead. So Jesus went down there into the heart of the earth and preached to the dead people, not fallen angels, people. Some interpret this that Jesus was preaching to the fallen angels, which were one time disobedient during the days of Noah. But no, it's quite clear he's preaching to people that are into revellings, banquetings, and lusts and excess of wine, revellings and abominable idolatries, much like those people that were once disobedient during the days of Noah, when once the long suffering of God waited, right, 120 years. Jesus, the long suffering of God, and finally giving Jesus, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So look at the love of God, the long suffering of God, waiting 120 years in the days of Noah when the ark was preparing. And then they go down into the underworld. They've been there ever since until Jesus comes along and preaches to them, making the gospel completely clear to them and even offering them hope in the underworld. How, right? Hades. So, verse 6, for this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, right, at the heart of the earth, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh. So the gospel was preached to men in the flesh, right, made clear to us what the gospel was. They didn't understand in the Old Testament. It's made more clear in the New Testament exactly what Jesus' ministry was going to entail. The mystery that has been hidden since the beginning of the world was revealed in the New Testament when Jesus lived it out, dying for the sins of mankind. So now making this completely clear to those also that were in that underworld, right? So for this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, offering them hope, even in hell, even in the underworld, even at the heart of the earth, even to those people that have gone to this place that preachers call hell fire, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, right? They'll have the same chances of us. They understand the gospel down there, according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the spirit. So there it is right there, but live. He's offering them hope that those that are in the underworld might live according to God in the spirit. Jesus went down there and said to them, look, here I am. I've died for the sins of mankind in that world, those that are living in the flesh, right? And also for you people down here in this world, offering them a way out. So again, for this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead. So why preach to them if there's no hope there? That they might be judged according to men in the flesh, have the same chances of us as us who understand the gospel in this world. They now understand the gospel in that world, offering them a way out. So they, what it says is, but live according to God in the spirit. So they can get out of their, much like we do here, we get out of the flesh and out of the lust of the flesh. And we choose to live, what it says here, but live according to God in the spirit. So we go God's way. Then we get into the spirit of God. We go man's way. Then we get into the lust of the flesh and finally find ourselves at the heart of the earth and living with the undead there, the living dead, those that go to the place where people go who didn't want God, who don't live in God's spirit, but live out the spirit and are prisoners to the lusts of their flesh down there. But Jesus offering them a way out so they might live according to God in the spirit. So he made it completely clear, really, that there is even hope in that underworld which preachers call hell. So praise Jesus, just to leave it there. And that's in just if anyone wants to review it and trust Jesus to speak to them through these words. So chapter 3, 1 Peter chapter 3, as from verses 18 through to chapter 4, down to verse 6. Verse 7 is interesting. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober, and watch unto prayer. And above all things have fervent charity, right, love, among yourselves, for charity, in other words, love, shall cover the multitude of sins, right? Use hospitality one to another without grudging. As every man have received the gift, even so minister the same one to another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracle of God, right, which Peter was doing. If any man minister, so he's doing his best, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ, right? to whom be praise and dominion forever and ever and ever. Amen. So praise Jesus.